Hello everybody! As you may or may not know, I'm still in rehab right now, and I will be for at least another 6 weeks. More details in my vlog on the second channel. It turns out rehab is mostly sitting in your room without anything to do, so I decided to watch unabomber documentaries on Netflix. And I thought, wow, this guy seems smart. So I read the entire Unabomber manifesto and I'm about to give you a critical chapter by chapter review of the entire thing. As you can tell by the length, I go into the details here, and when applicable, I explain why the logic is flawed. Full disclosure, I disagree with the manifesto, but I will be trying to be as neutral as I can be, except for the parts which are obviously my opinions. If you already know who the Unabomber was and why he's famous, feel free to use the YouTube chapter tool to skip the summary. On May the 25th of 1978, a materials engineering professor received a package in the mail. Upon opening it, it exploded in his hands, causing minor injuries. Over the following years, more parcel bombs were sent to universities and airlines. They knew those bombs came from the same person or group because they all had a metal plaque with the engraving FC in them. They named the person responsible the University and Airline Bomber, or Unabomber. For 17 years he sent bombs, a total of 16, killing 3 people and permanently maiming 12 others. Then he sent a manifesto to major newspapers, and he demanded they print it in full or he will keep bombing people. After some deliberation, the FBI gave the papers the go-ahead to print the manifesto. The thought was that if everyone read it, then someone may recognize the ideas in it. This was a great strategy and it worked. A man reported to the FBI that his brother, a 50-year-old man named Ted Kaczynski, had very similar ideas. Kaczynski lived in a 5x5 meter shack in the woods, living only of what he planted and what he hunted, for over 20 years at that point. When he was a kid, he was considered very smart and he enrolled in Harvard at age 16. He became a mathematics professor, and after making enough money to buy some land and build his shack, he moved there, completely off the grid. After comparing Kaczynski's letter to the manifesto of the Unabomber, the FBI obtained a warrant to search his cabin. They found a finished parcel bomb, chemicals to build bombs, bomb parts, a detailed log of all the bombs he sent, as well as a draft of his manifesto and the typewriter that was used to send his letters and the manifesto. In the end, he was convicted and is currently sitting in solitary confinement for the rest of his life. He would have gotten the death penalty, but he was ruled criminally insane after a diagnosis with paranoid schizophrenia. His mental illness is in my eyes not an excuse for what he did or for his ideas. The source of some parts of his mental illness is undoubtedly the MK Ultra project, which, TLDR, was an attempt by the CIA to completely psychologically break someone, and at age 16, Kaczynski was one of the guinea pigs. Again, this is no excuse, but it explains some of his antisocial tendencies, which you may notice in the manifesto. The manifesto he wrote has been read by millions, and it resonated with many. It has co-founded an entire ideology called anarcho-primitivism, which you may have heard about before. So let's not waste any more time, this video will be long enough as is. And one note before we start. The manifesto is written like a thesis from the 70s, and it has these subheadings here. I will call those chapters or sections, even though they technically aren't. Oh, and also he sometimes writes we. That is to make the public believe he's more than one person. Just ignore that. That being said, here we go. The first chapter is called Intro, and all it is a very basic overview over the points he will make throughout the manifesto. This part is supposed to be catchy, and to be fair, it does create curiosity, which is the point. He asserts that our current society, based on technology and industry, is bad for the people and the environment, and that it will become even worse over time. Now, He admits that it may eventually get better, but he's convinced that first it will definitely get a lot worse. He also freely admits that destroying this system will cause untold suffering, but he thinks abandoning modern technology would cause less pain than leaving it in place. Quite an assertion. I can't wait to see how he logically supports this. But for some reason, the next chapter is about the psychology of leftism. Alright? He explains how in the past leftism meant socialists and friends of the USSR, but that now it's harder to define who is and isn't a leftist. He writes, when we speak of leftism in this article, we have in mind mainly socialists, collectivists, politically correct types, feminism, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists, and the like. He asserts that leftists are characterized by two things: feelings of inferiority and oversocialization, which coincidentally is the title of the next two chapters. According to him, feelings of inferiority are characterized by low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, self-hatred, etc. Then he complains about white activists and professors not wanting him to use racist words and calling people primitive for being illiterate. And he says that, quote, leftists tend to hate everything that has an image of being strong, good, and successful. They hate America, they hate Western civilization, and they hate white males. They hate rationality. Then he says that leftists reject IQ tests, which is a bad thing apparently, followed by saying that some people are obviously inferior and that the leftists are bad for wanting to treat inferior people with respect. He also complains that leftists make up problems to force people to adhere to political correctness. In the last paragraph he says it's not all leftists, just the bad ones he made up. The next part is oversocialization. He explains that socialization means learning to act like society demands. He asserts that leftists are so socialized that they want to act too moral, so they force others not to say the N-word. Their over-socialization makes them unable of doing small moral violations, like traffic violations and petty theft. He says, quote, university intellectuals constitute the most highly socialized segment of our society and also the most left-wing segment. The universities are cultural Marxists, scaremongering here. He says leftists don't rebel, they just take society's expectations to the extreme, which means they aren't radical, they're actually secretly controlling society. Then he says that the leftists are the real racists for trying to give black people the same conditions as white people, which would make them the same to the system. Then he chickens out again and says not all leftists. Okay, where do I begin? How about the vibe? I'm gonna say it, this is some serious boomer shit. The leftists are all inferior and stupid and the real racists, and they control the academics and actually the government is secretly on their side and so on. This sounds like some high-grade PragerU opinions. Yes, it was written in the 90s, but it's clear this guy never talked to a leftist in his life. Also, he says if black people were as rich as white people, then they wouldn't be special anymore. Apparently, what makes black culture different is poverty and nothing else. And apparently, because of that, we need to prevent emancipation. Great thinking, Ted. I would like to make the point that Ted here is using a framework in which the only important thing is the industrial technological system, as he calls it. We can tell because he says the only thing making black people special is that they are a poorer part of the system, which shows that his worldview doesn't care about culture, values, or anything besides the system. The next chapter introduces an important point, the power process. Basically, the power process is people using their individual power to reach some goal or fulfill some need. Like, for example, you use your individual freedom to get a job so you can reach the goal of buying food, or a caveman hunts a deer to get to survive. Going through the power process needs two things. First, a goal which you yourself set and which will bring you satisfaction, and you need to have the individual autonomy or power to be able to reach that goal yourself somehow. And once you finish the power process, you experience happiness and search for a new goal. He says that humans always need to be able to have goals which are in reach, and going through the power process is the fundamental thing that makes people happy. Every source of happiness is just the power process in disguise. And to prevent people from going through the power process would make them miserable and thus be immoral. He also makes the point that people who have everything, like aristocrats during the Renaissance, become decadent and depressed for lack of goals in life. I think this concept is broadly correct. Everyone needs goals to keep themselves busy, and it is important that that goal is in reach. But what if you fulfilled all of your survival needs? You have a home, food, clothing, and so on. So from a biological standpoint, you ran out of goals. He says that what people do then is searching for pointless activities like collecting stamps or working out to have big muscles which you don't need. He calls these things surrogate activities, to sound fancier. He makes the argument that if someone had to work really hard to survive, they would be just as fulfilled by surviving as modern people are fulfilled after doing pointless surrogate activities. So industrial society made our lives so easy that everyone can survive with comparatively little effort, causing many people to waste their time with surrogate activities. And he considers them a waste of time. He doesn't explain which value system he uses to evaluate what is a valid way to get happiness and what isn't. So this feels extremely arbitrary. Personally, I disagree. I think as long as you have a goal and, more importantly, tasks that make you happy, it doesn't matter if it's programming a game for your boss to be able to eat nice food or programming a game in your spare time for fun. See, I am a utilitarian. I want society to do what brings the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest amount of people. This means supporting things that bring happiness and not arbitrarily declaring that collecting stamps is bad actually because evolution. Note that even though he thinks surrogate activities are bad, he still admits that doing them is just as gratifying as doing real activities, as he calls them. But his preferring tasks like hunting over stamp collecting will become a theme later. The following chapter is called Autonomy. No shock, Kaczynski wants more individual autonomy. He begins by arguing that voluntarily working together in small groups can also satisfy the power process. He explains this is because humans evolved to hunt in groups, so achieving a goal in a small group is just as pleasing as doing it alone. But he argues the same is not true for having to take orders from above, from some boss, because that way you can't use your autonomy to do the tasks. You need to listen to the superior. Remember, the power process is about doing things with your own autonomy or power. So if you do something not because you want it, but because someone else tells you to, then you won't find pleasure in doing it. The same is true for orders from a large collective. The argument goes that if there are 1,000 people voting on what to do, then every individual has too little power over the decision to feel like it was theirs, which again prevents them from going through the power process, which, as we established, makes people unhappy. He then admits that some people are fine without autonomy in the workplace. When I worked in the heavy industry, lots of my colleagues liked not thinking about work, just doing exactly what the supervisor said and then going home. Kaczynski says that while these people exist, the vast majority need to use their own autonomy to reach self-set goals to be happy. He then explains that people who are prevented from going through the power process may suffer from, quote, boredom, demoralization, low self-esteem, inferiority feelings, defeatism, depression, anxiety, guilt, frustration, hostility, spouse or child abuse, insatiable hedonism, abnormal sexual behavior, sleep disorders, eating disorders, etc. So apparently every single issue in the world is caused by this one thing. Very convenient, because this means we can abolish psychology now. Needless to say, I think that explaining all of human happiness and misery using one concept is going to be at best a gross oversimplification of the truth, and at worst may lead you to incredibly harmful conclusions. I am sorry to say this, but my drinking was caused by my traumatic memories, not because I couldn't set myself goals. This shows that Kaczynski likely never suffered from most of these issues, because if he did, he would know that they're a bit more complex than being told how to work by a supervisor. He continues his hobby analysis of society's problems in the chapter titled Sources of Social Problems. He starts off by saying that not all problems are from industrial society, and primitive societies also had bad parts. Quote, "It is true that not all was sweetness and light in primitive societies. Abuse of women was common among the Australian Aborigines. Transsexuality was fairly common among the American Indian tribes. But despite the evil transsexuals, he says primitive society was still superior to modern society." He makes the evolutionary psychology argument and says that since humans didn't evolve for our current environment, it is bad. Society is too densely populated, too isolated from nature, and doesn't allow for small-scale groups like tribes, which we evolved for. He tries to make an argument against modern technology using a motorcycle. He says there are two ways you can be managed by society, either unrestricted or restricted. If you make it unrestricted, then the noise will make people cause negative feelings to other people. If you restrict it, you will take away the liberty of the motorcycle owner. Therefore, motorcycles are inherently negative for society. Now, you may pause for a second and think about what is wrong with this argument. It took me between 5 to 10 seconds. Did you get it? He's forgetting the positives. A motorcycle allows for greater mobility, and that greater mobility of one outweighs the minor convenience of noise for someone else. Like he's deliberately ignoring the upsides of modern technology to make it look bad. He's making a pro and contra list with only the negatives. That's not how this works. He then says that people in society feel less secure than in primitive societies, which he elaborates on later. In paragraph 50 we learn that, quote, "the conservatives are fools," which is at least one thing we can agree on. Then fascinatingly, he says that settlers on the American frontier around 1830 or so had no social group and didn't suffer from mental illness because they weren't crowded like we are today, and they had plenty of opportunity to go through the power process on their farms, which means they were a lot more happy than we are today. This is interesting for two reasons. First, his positive portrayal of the state of technology implies that the world he wants is one which is around that tech level. I don't know about you, but I imagined anarcho-primitivists as like a Stone Age society without any technology. But spoiler, Kaczynski only ever argues against the technology of the Industrial Revolution. He doesn't seem to want a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. I think more in the chapter Strategy, in which he lays out specific goals. The second reason this glorification of frontier farmers is interesting is because he said they had no mental illness, despite being completely isolated from society, which is fascinating because that's the opposite of what happened. They all became extremely mentally ill. Now, we've only gained our modern understanding of mental illness in the 80s and 90s, but even 150 years before that, people noticed that all these farmers who were completely isolated on the prairie got very mentally ill, which they called prairie madness. So one of Kaczynski's examples of people without society being healthy literally shows the opposite of what he says. Like, maybe he should have spent his time doing research instead of building bombs. I think at this point I repeated myself enough that everyone knows what I mean when I say the power process. This chapter is titled Disruption of the Power Process in Modern Society, and shockingly, it says how modern society is bad because power process. He explains, quote, "We divide human drives into 3 groups. 1, those drives that can be satisfied with minimal effort. 2, those that can be satisfied but only at the cost of serious effort. And 3, those that cannot be adequately satisfied no matter how much effort one makes. And the power process is the process of satisfying the drives of the second group. The more drives there are in the third group, the more there is frustration, anger, eventually defeatism, depression, etc. Then he asserts that technological industrial society pushes more and more things from group 2 into groups 1 and 3. For example, you can fulfill your survival needs with so little effort that you likely don't feel too accomplished every time you get to eat lunch. And on the other hand, you know that getting a Tesla will likely be out of your reach forever, unless you get very lucky and win in capitalism. This is what he means when he says goals move into groups 1 and 3. He says that primitive society put survival things into group 2, which made people happier. Yes, they had to work a lot harder to get meat on the table, but it was precisely that it was harder, which made it more rewarding. He then explains how advertising creates arbitrary needs, which fall into group 2, to keep the average person busy with surrogate activities. Remember, the pointless ones. So if you're happy in modern society, then you're just brainwashed, and also you shouldn't be happy because your happiness comes from bad activity. Clearly. Then he channels this in a socialist and critiques capitalism without realizing it. He argues that employees are oppressed by employers, which reduces the freedom. Personally, what I would do is yeet the employers and have their position be elected, or even having a council do their job. Now the workers are in charge and have the liberty back, and it didn't even require abandoning modern agriculture and medicine. He then elaborates that there are many group 3 drives because, quote, our lives depend on decisions made by other people. He names police, government and capitalists and continues, it may be objected that primitive man is physically less secure than modern man, as is shown by his shorter life expectancy. But psychological security does not closely correspond with physical security. He then argues that when faced with a threat like a lion, a primitive man can defend, while most modern people can't defend against nuclear accidents. Therefore, most threats nowadays fall into group 3, since we're faced with threats much larger than we can influence ourselves, like climate change and chemical spills. Of course, notice how he says a life expectancy of 20 is fine as long as you can run from a lion instead of losing a job. Kaczynski notices that, quote, there is no law that says that we have to go to work every day and follow our employer's orders. Legally, there is nothing preventing us from going to live in the wild, like primitive people, or going into business ourselves. But in practice, there is very little wild country left, and there is room in the economy for only a limited amount of businesses. Hence, most of us can survive only as someone else's employee, which is exactly like the argument I made. Well, technically, you aren't forced to work under capitalism. The conditions we live in force us to work for employers involuntarily. The difference is that Kaczynski wants to destroy everything to fix this, while I think removing bosses and having their tasks be done by workers should do the trick. In general, it seems like he isn't aware of most political ideologies and factions, considering the only solution he ever considers is abandoning modern society. He has this weird rant about leftists, but as will be even more clear later on, he has no clue what socialism even means. He then finishes the chapter by saying that people who want to reform the system to allow people to go through the power process are wrong and need to think bigger. He doesn't elaborate, it's just something he says. The chapter, How Some People Adjust, is, unsurprisingly, about how some people cope with this evil technological society. He says some are just fine with things as they are, some satisfy their need for power by joining large movements which collectively seek out goals, and then these people feel successful. But Kaczynski tells us that they shouldn't feel successful because it wasn't their individual achievement. So he's gatekeeping what people are allowed to enjoy, so they're only allowed to enjoy what he says they enjoy, which conveniently is everything that fits his theory, and anything that doesn't fit isn't allowed to be enjoyed because it wouldn't fit the theory. Nice example of circular logic, Kaczynski. Then he makes the worst take. But even if most people in industrial technological society were well satisfied, we would still be opposed to that form of society, because among other reasons, we consider it demeaning to fulfill one's need for power through surrogate activities or through identification with an organization, rather than through the pursuit of real goals. To translate, yes, people may be happy, but they aren't happy in the way I like, so they don't deserve to be happy in this way. Great. The next section is called The Motives of Scientists. You would think that you can just ask a scientist what they're motivated by. Most will tell you about curiosity and the drive to make the world better. But Ted knows the scientists better than they know themselves. He says scientists can't be motivated by curiosity, since there is no way someone is interested in the specific things that a single study studies. He says no normal person would be interested in the interaction of diethylene glycol and alcohol in the liver. Therefore, all scientists are liars and have a secret agenda. Last time I talked about scientific research, there were multiple researchers in my comment section. If you are one of them, please tell me what you think of this section. Kaczynski says a chemist is only interested in chemistry because the chemist had a chemistry education. And if the chemist was forced to be a lawyer, they would not care for chemistry, but would rather be super interested in law, which is a wild assertion, because it basically says people have no innate curiosity or interest in specific subjects at all, which is at odds with all of the research. Also, to quickly disprove this, my formal education is in computer science, and I make my money by making videos on politics, which would be impossible under his explanation, because according to him, getting my computer science education would make me love computers, while really I feel lukewarm to them at best. Now comes the quote I laughed at. Some scientific work has no conceivable relation to the welfare of the human race. Most of archaeology and comparative linguistics, for example. This is funny because comparative linguistics is how he was caught. And I'd argue that catching a serial bomber is supporting the welfare of the human race, as he put it. Then he straight up calls all scientific works surrogate activities, which is at odds with his own definition. Sure, maybe some scientists only work on their tasks to keep themselves busy, presumably subconsciously. But earlier he said that doing a job to get money to fulfill your base needs is not a surrogate activity, but rather a necessary one. Scientists make their money with research. He is making arguments that invalidate his own definitions. Amazing! In the section titled The Nature of Freedom, he explains his theory that the further society progresses, the less freedom for everyone there is. He explains that he defines freedom as going through the power process. The more you can go through the power process, the more free you are. The fewer times you can, the less free you are. And since, as he explained before, society is making more and more things into goals of type 1 and 3, prevents people from the gratifying type 2 tasks. The idea that with an advancing society, perhaps new type 2 tasks will be created either doesn't cross his mind or he dismisses them as inferior surrogate activities. He makes the point that the media is dominated by single news agencies, which means nobody outside of the mainstream can spread their ideas. To his credit, YouTube wasn't around at this time. Then he justifies killing people to draw attention to his half-baked manifesto, which worked, but also major dick move. Oh god, wait a second. I'm popularizing his views right now. Oh god, I'm a part of the problem. Then my notes say, people may say that they are true, but TED talks over them and says that they aren't. I can't say I know what I tried to say with that. After reading the relevant paragraph, I think this is supposed to say that some people feel they are free, but TED doesn't care if you feel free. He knows better than you. So don't you feel free? Now we get into how he explains history in some principles of history. He says that in his view, history is both random events and greater trends. The random events are just that, random unexplainable events which are of little importance. Instead, the important part is the greater trend. And that trend is for society to keep developing new technology and greater industry. And this trend can be temporarily obstructed. For example, activists may stop the construction of new factories for years or decades. But eventually the resistance will fall and the factories are built anyways. The only way this large trend can be stopped is via a revolution, which can overthrow the entire system and thus stop it from evolving. He also freely admits that the outcome of a revolution cannot be predicted. As proof, he talks about the US war for independence. He says it didn't change much, since all other English colonies eventually became independent and democratic as well. So if there was a war for independence, the US would still be a democracy today. Then he wrote in all caps, and I quote, "Industrial technological society cannot be reformed," which is an opinion, and he doesn't explain why at all. Later, when he complains about cars reducing freedom, I will show a nice practical example of reforming society in a way that even under his definition would be more free, but more of that later. Then he repeats himself and says that the march of technology strengthens the system and reduces freedom. He repeats himself a lot, and I usually edit it out because it makes for a bad video and a bad manifesto. But I didn't make the manifesto, I'm making the video, so I decided to leave out what makes it bad. Well, worse. The next section is titled, "Restriction of Freedom is Unavoidable in Industrial Society." I wonder what that will be about. He explains that for the state and industry to function, capitalists and bureaucrats need to be in charge and rule the masses, which then naturally reduces the autonomy of said masses. You may want to resolve this by fragmenting government down into small communities, which anarchists are for. But Kaczynski objects to that. Quote, "A technological society cannot be broken down into small autonomous communities because production depends on the cooperation of very large numbers of people and machines." I sort of agree with him on this. It's true that without long-distance trade and global specialization, the economy, as it functions right now, would be impossible to keep alive. Naturally, there are ways around this, but Ted doesn't know them because he didn't read theory. He again explains that democracy feels too intangible and the individual doesn't have enough say, and explains that the system protects itself by making people conform. For example, the system needs engineers, so it makes people become engineers by financially rewarding them. A better way to describe this dynamic would be supply and demand, because Ted seems to treat this ominous system like some sort of evil hive mind instead of it being the logical consequence of the mechanisms of our society interacting with the population. The next section is descriptively called "The bad parts of technology cannot be separated from the good parts." He makes the point that modern medicine can only exist if there's also modern chemistry, computer science, education, and so on. Like you can't keep vaccines and abolish refrigeration. I agree with him on this, but I would like to argue that we can do something about many of the bad parts. For example, we can pass climate change legislation. We can collectivize factories and reform the economy away from the capitalist system that is causing suffering to untold amounts of people. I admit that we can't get all of the good parts and not get rid of the bad parts. Like, I know we can't keep expecting to get a sweater for $5 and stop sweatshops in poor countries. To get rid of the bad parts will mean sacrificing some good. But to pretend we can't do anything but to revert back to a time without medicine is just insane to me. Then comes possibly the worst part of the manifesto. He says that in primitive society, which he still hasn't told us what he means, people would have died from diabetes, but we keep them alive, which degrades humanity. Quote, the only solution will be some sort of eugenics program or extensive genetic engineering of human beings. So yeah, not only is he extremely anti-leftist and a social conservative, he also just openly advocated for eugenics, or alternatively reintroducing evolutionary pressure, which does the exact same thing. And of course, he knows millions of people will die, mainly the ones with disabilities and things like diabetes or glasses, which is ableist, extremely immoral, and the direct consequence of abandoning modern medicine and farming. This is why I consider primitivist ideologies to be only useful as a thought experiment and never as a goal. The next section is called Technology is a more powerful social force than the aspiration for freedom. No prizes for guessing what he's gonna tell us here. He says technology slowly takes away freedoms without compromise. As an example, he makes the point that cars initially made people freer, but now people depend on them to get to work and grocery shopping. So owning them and following traffic laws are now mandatory. He continues his point by saying, quote, once a technical innovation has been induced, people usually become dependent on it. He says cars are bad because traffic laws reduce freedom, and he yet again completely misses the upside of having a car. Like, you can move over an entire continent with one. Yes, you have to follow traffic laws, but you have a mobility which even 100 years ago would have been unimaginable to pretty much everyone. It's almost as if this guy tries to hyper-focus on the small downsides of technology. Of course, there is also his point that now that cars exist, we're doomed to use them forever. There is no way a modern industrial city could ever be set up in a way to discourage the use of cars and enable people to travel with, let's say, public transport, bikes, and by walking. Completely impossible. Wait, who put Amsterdam on the screen? That's not fair. This was after Ted wrote this. For the ones out of the loop, in the past decades, Amsterdam, especially in the inner city, was transformed from a car-heavy hellhole to the city with the most cyclists per capita in the world. Many roads are blocked off for cars and only allowed for pedestrians and bikes. This way, the city discourages people from owning cars and encourages cycling and walking, which is healthier, and I guess to Ted it's freer. But I would argue, even more importantly than that, it immensely reduces pollution, which, considering climate change, is a pretty good goal. So there, I used Amsterdam to prove that a future without any cars is possible. And considering the limited existence of oil and the problem of climate change, it's inevitable. Ted continues to explain that the reason technology always wins out over the opposition is that those people who work in research do so because it's their surrogate activity. It's what gives them a purpose in life, while people who protest that change only have the goal to stop something. And he argues that having something to strive for is always more rewarding than opposing something. So eventually the activists will stop resisting and technology will progress. In Simpler Social Problems Have Proven Intraceable, he writes that, quote, among other things, the system has failed to stop environmental degradation, political corruption, drug trafficking, or domestic abuse. And he continues that because of that, the system cannot solve the problem of liberty. Personally, I agree that the system, more precisely the capitalist system, can't solve most of these issues. So it's on activists like environmentalists to make it do it. And to be kind of fair, a little bit, some of the capitalist countries have done the absolute minimum necessary to potentially start protecting the climate in the future one day. Same criticism as before. He can't imagine a system beyond this one, so his solution is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. To abolish technology and industry instead of changing from a capitalist to a socialist system. Which is, of course, because it pretends capitalism and socialism are the same thing, because both have cars. He follows up with, revolution is easier than reform, which I consider a hot take, because reform is, at least organizationally, easier to start and succeed with. Note, Wiki 1999 does not officially support violence or illegal action. Ted writes that the system and liberty can't be reconciled, which means radical change is needed. He mentions it doesn't have to be a violent uprising, but it needs to be called a revolution. He argues that since a revolution would replace the whole system, it would achieve more because reform can only change one thing at a time. Which is strange thinking because reformists can push for many things at the same time. Reality is not turn-based. The next section is titled Control of Human Behavior. It's shockingly about how the system controls human behavior. He makes the argument that all societies control the humans that live in them via laws, social conventions and so on. And he points at modern society and says that it especially controls the people in it and that it is able to push people way further into misery than was possible before modern medicine. See, the reason is that if someone becomes depressed, which as you remember is only caused by life being too easy, according to him, they will be treated with antidepressants to continue to function. He then asserts that people need to distract themselves from what the system does to them via video games and media. And he points out that superficially, things like antidepressants and the media are good. After all, not treating a depressed person would be immoral, and taking away entertainment from people would be cruel as well. But these things are of course bad, because then you depend on the antidepressants for happiness and on the media for entertainment. And clearly taking antidepressants is a worse fate than killing yourself because of depression. At least to Ted. Then he channels his inner Marx and says, the social disruption that we see today is certainly not a result of mere chance. It can only be a result of the conditions of life that the system imposes on people, which is unsurprisingly sort of similar to historical materialism, which says that eventually capitalism will bring about its own destruction. I made a video on that. In this section called Human Race at a Crossroads, he makes the point that right now we have the opportunity for great change in society. This is because right now the industrial technological system is struggling with rebellion and climate change. He expects the system to stabilize in roughly 40 to 100 years, and he says by that point, the time we can do something has passed. Then he makes an argument which I in the past used to discredit accelerationism, and that is the fact that even if the system were to collapse because of climate change, it would rebuild itself, simply because the people don't know another way to build up a society. For this reason, Ted wants to both destroy the old system and create a new one in its place. Then he again admits that destroying the system, including medicine and agriculture, would kill billions, especially people who depend on medicine, like old people, disabled people, everyone with a mental illness, probably almost all children, and in general, everyone who isn't super fit and knowledgeable about how to survive without anything. Of course, Ted says this is worth it as long as he doesn't have to hear a motorbike. Then he comes with the hot take and says that the Industrial Revolution didn't improve people's lives. This is again because he uses this very restrictive framework in which only working toward a goal brings happiness and only the basic needs count as valid goals. I don't know about you, but I personally think running around in the forest with torn and dirty clothing, with nothing but a spear, trying to catch a deer in the middle of a hailstorm, sounds less rewarding than playing Fallout New Vegas with a full belly and a heated home. The only reason Ted considers Fallout inferior to hunting is because he arbitrarily decided happiness from non-survival related sources doesn't count. In the section titled The Future, he predicts some things which he thinks are likely to happen in the near future, if the industrial system is not destroyed before then. He points out two scenarios. In the first one, computers become super intelligent and they may take over our society, and in the second one, computers stay under humanity's control, in which case the machine owners would exploit the non-machine owners. If the machines become super intelligent, it's not possible to predict what they would do. They could do anything from reversing climate change and colonizing the galaxy to killing every last human. I'm sure you heard about all of the scenarios. The second scenario is a lot more fleshed out. He says that if machines don't reach super intelligence, then they will stay under the control of humanity. But they will still eliminate most jobs because of automatization, which would cause society to split into two groups, the machine owners and everyone else. Of course, you can collectivize the machines and as a society decide that these machines are taken from the machine owners and use them for the public good, but Ted doesn't even consider that. He also mentions that it's possible that people would move into service jobs, but Kaczynski doesn't consider service jobs to be fulfilling, so he thinks that would be a bad thing. About that possibility, he writes, quote, "This seems to us a thoroughly contemptible way for the human race to end up, and we doubt that many people would find fulfilling lives in such pointless busy work." He considers this possible future so horrible and evil that he writes, quote, "It would be better to dump the whole stinking system and take the consequences." Which again, the consequences he's talking about is killing billions of people. The chapter strategy is two things. First, it's finally an explanation of what his goals are. Kind of. And how he wants to reach them. And second, it's the most mangled chapter of the entire manifesto. He keeps making confusing statements and switches what he talks about every paragraph. I decided to break this down into his goals and his steps to reach them. Just know that if you read it, it's a lot more confusing than I am making it look. His goals are destroying technology, destroying industry, and destroying the modern state. He says most revolutions didn't change society, and he uses the French and Russian revolutions as an example, which yet again shows that he is unable to see the difference between different societies, because to him every post-industrial society is the same. He tells us that his ideology is one of wild nature, wild spelled in all caps, so you get the message. In other parts, he talks about reintroducing evolutionary pressure, which implies he doesn't want a society like the oh-so-happy farmers with prairie madness. He also concedes that even before industrial society, damage was done to nature, but it was on a small scale, which is not true. Australia used to be a jungle until people started burning the jungle down to drive the animals out, and now it's mostly desert. People have been manipulating the environment since forever. Then he says, quote, "Everyone must be a peasant or herdsman or fisherman or hunters," which implies that he wants to keep farming and herding, so not hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but more something like the Bronze Age, I guess. Later he says it would take 500 to 1,000 years for his dream society to turn into a new industrial society, which implies technology standards from the Middle Ages. My main problem is that this manifesto is so vague on what it wants to achieve. It has some great rants about the evils of having to hear a motorbike go by, but it completely lacks the vision to guide people to this great new world he's promising. And I'm not joking, this is where the goal sections end. The only other slight insight we get into his dream world is that he talks about which technologies we should keep, which we'll get into after we discussed how he wants to implement his vague idea of a pre-industrial society. He starts off by saying that his ideology should be propagated in two different ways. In a detailed academic way directed at well-educated people who would then form a fanatic core and spread the message to the masses by dumbing it down for them. To support this, he says, don't shame people for consuming, portray them as victims of the system. To spread the message and manipulate the, well, he calls them stupid, I'm gonna say average apolitical person, He wants to use the media to the best of his ability. He then explains that you don't need the majority of the population as followers of your idea. You just need a bunch of really convinced people, which historically is true. Only 30% of Americans wanted independence from England, and barely anyone was a Bolshevik before the revolution. But he also says, quote, "The revolution must be international and worldwide." And, of course, all at the same time, so the army from one nation can't crush the ones who already went through the revolution. Then he points out how important it is that nobody ever attaches another goal to his movement. No gay rights, no feminism, no Black Lives Matter, only the industrial technological system matters. Here on the left wing we have something called class reductionist. That's when you ignore all social problems in the world and only focus on the class conflict. This is seen as a bad strategy by most, since if you openly say you don't care about black lives, then black people may not want to join your revolution. Kaczynski also says you don't need to bother taking over the government. It will collapse without that once the industry and technology that uphold modern governments is destroyed. Then comes quite possibly the worst part of the entire manifesto, almost worse than the eugenics part. He says that you should have many children to put stress on the system so it will collapse sooner. This means he wants you and the entire global revolutionary movement to artificially increase the global population beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, so we bring about a system in which 98% of the people have to starve, which will include those children. He's talking about using children as political tool and then letting them die because you don't want to have to buy a car or hear a motorcycle. I'm beginning to see why he was determined criminally insane. In the section, Two Kinds of Technology, Kaczynski explains exactly what technology he wants destroyed and what technology he wants to keep in his utopia. He divides technology into small-scale technology and large, organization-dependent technology. Small-scale technology refers to technology small groups could use without the need for a large-scale economy. This is the kind of technology Kaczynski has no problem with. He names the water wheel as an example. Even without modern technology, a craftsman can build one, which seems to make sense, but he also names steel as an example, which I don't know about. To make steel, you need blast furnaces and mines for coal and iron, aka you need an organized economy. And the same is true for the water wheel, actually. Like, you need iron or steel tools, you need wood to work, you need a builder to build the building next to which to install the water wheel, and you need to somehow get fed while doing that. Also, building a water wheel needs some extent of education, so you need a society to make that work. This either means Kaczynski is completely fine with an organized society that reduces people's freedom as long as there is no industry around, or he didn't think about what he wrote. I can't deal with this information, I can only guess. Then he explains that organization-dependent technology is anything that you need a society for. For example, a fridge. You need chemistry, precision metalworking, power, and so on. A fridge can only exist in an organized society, which, if you think about it, the same is true for the water wheel and steel. So yeah, the tech which he thinks is okay is completely arbitrary. This is where he says that after they reach this glorious ideal world, industrial society and technology may return, but we don't need to worry about it since it would take more than our lifetimes, so it doesn't matter. We now come to the final chapter before the conclusion. And what do you think this one is about? Finally describing what that great world would look like. Explaining further why the power process only counts when hunting deer? Nope, none of that. It is titled The Danger of Leftism. You may be wondering, hey, didn't he start off the manifesto with complaining about the left? And the answer is yes he did. I did the math, and 15% of the manifesto is him writing about leftists. Only 5% are about explaining the power process, which is his core argument. So remember, in the first part, he said the leftist social justice activists. Well, here he changes his opinion. He explains that leftists are still too immature and stupid to have real goals, so they seek collective power. Then he explains how leftists are collectivists and pro-big government, which I guess is true for the USSR, but that completely contradicts his definition from the start. Then he says all anarchists must hate technology, you see, because it enables central government via highways and quick communications. A great way to alienate all anarchists, tell them they're doing anarchism wrong, and only your anarchism is true anarchism, of course. Then he makes the observation that in the past, leftists often collaborated with non-leftists in the short term to seize power, after which they usually kicked out the other factions. Because of that, he says leftists cannot be trusted. He writes, quote, "To avoid this, a movement that exalts nature and opposes technology must take a resolutely anti-leftist stance and must avoid all collaboration with leftists." Then he says that leftists are totalitarians. Leftists invade privacy and reduce autonomy. All of these show that he's not talking about social justice warriors anymore. He's talking about authoritarian leftists, tankies, the USSR and so on. And, you know, I would respect that. It's his opinion. Everyone has those. But then he chickens out and says, quote, "Our remarks about leftism are not meant to apply to every individual leftist, but to describe the general character of the leftist movement." Then following, he says that he himself isn't sure what he means by leftist. So he makes a list of features. They are collectivists, they dislike individualism, they actually, let me just quote him. Oh yeah, he's sexist, so when talking about the average leftist, he uses he-him pronouns instead of they-them. He tends to be for gun control, for sex education, and other psychologically enlightened educational methods, for social planning, for affirmative action, for multiculturalism. He tends to identify with victims. He tends to be against competition and against violence, but he often finds excuses for those leftists who do commit violence. He is fond of using the common catchphrases of the left like racism, sexism, homophobia, capitalism, imperialism, neocolonialism, genocide, social change, social justice, social responsibility. Maybe the best diagnostic trait of all leftists is his tendency to sympathize with the following movements: feminism, gay rights, ethnic rights, disability rights, animal rights, political correctness. Anyone who strongly sympathizes with all of these movements is almost certainly a leftist. So, there you have it. That is leftism, apparently. The last chapter, final note, is just a summary of the things he already talked about, with only one interesting quote. Of course, in a discussion of this kind, one must rely heavily on intuitive judgment. And that can sometimes be wrong. So we don't claim that this article expresses more than a crude approximation of that truth. Excuse me, Ted? You made me read and write notes for 5 hours only to tell me this shit isn't accurate at the end. This seems like a lazy way to avoid being criticized by saying absolute bullshit. Oh, you can't say I'm wrong because I said I may be wrong. I don't end my videos with, oh, by the way, take nothing seriously. Come on, grow a spine and stand by your subpar theories, for fuck's sake. Conclusion. It's so much worse than I made it look. It's badly structured. The order of the chapters makes little sense. He keeps repeating himself. Like, he explains every point 3 times at completely different parts of the manifesto. He just says things and treats them as if they are true. For example, he says that only since the 1800s did mental illness exist, which isn't true. There was likely tons of mental illness in the past, but we only started diagnosing them 100 years ago. Selection bias, come on, Ted. He cites maybe 3 sources throughout the entire thing. He leaves massive questions like, what is that imaginary pre-industrial society supposed to look like exactly? This is an extremely basic question, and we only get vague answers at the very end of the manifesto. It's clear that he has some kind of valid criticisms of the industrial society, but has no vision besides technology bad. At this point, I have to say, I genuinely think that the ideas expressed in this manifesto are overwhelmingly bad. At points, he makes great criticism of the capitalist system, like when he explains that people are forced to work by the system, and how almost everyone has to be an employee, which reduces freedom. There are good points here, but he lacks the imagination for a solution. There is one last point I would like to make before ending this video. Do you remember how Kaczynski said that if we were living in the woods, we would all be fulfilled because we'd use all our autonomy to go through the power process by hunting and foraging. So we wouldn't even miss modern technology because we're already happy with life by fulfilling our base needs. But if that is the case, I have to ask, why wasn't Kaczynski happy? He lived in his hut, he foraged for food, he spent his days hunting. If this fulfilled his need to go through the power process, how come he still felt the need to write the manifesto and bomb people? Maybe humans need more than what he thinks they do. Maybe this man who was isolated from everyone for 20 years didn't understand everything about human psychology. Thanks for watching to the end. This video was really long, but I didn't want to leave out any important points because this video is the only chapter by chapter summary of the manifesto there is on YouTube, and at least the time of recording, and leaving out parts could have misinformed people. Thanks to all my Patreons who allow me to pay for rehab, and as always, be mindful of where you place your arms in relation to the airbag. Special thanks to Comrade Asshole, Darius the Bird, Dave Lewis, Eric Betts, Xander Corvus, Attila Nemes, Katie Reeves, Carissa, Chairman Pineapple, Daniel Hyman, Daphne, Dr. Grimm, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gabi Gita, Herdington Gerdington, Josh C., Joshua Clark, Clastrup, Masije Rojek, Nane Epema, Neil Banderi, Nora Quinn, Ollie, Poke, Raymond DeVille, Roman Bride, Sean Murphy, Skylar Magnum Turner, Stairmaster Chef and Trey.